So we're in the book of 1 Peter, right? A series called The Road Less Traveled, and it's really following the theme that this church has been going through all year of answering this question. What does it look like for the people of God, for those who follow Yahweh, Jesus Christ is Lord, triune God, right? Father, Son, Holy Spirit, those of us who answer to that God, what does it look like to be a part of that community, to be a part of that family, follow that God in a world where everyone else could care less, right? How do we follow Jesus in a non-Jesus following world? And we've gone through Daniel and seen what he had to say about that issue. And now we're going through Peter. And Peter is interesting because he's on the other side of the cross, right? He's talking to a church that knows Jesus, that knows the hope of the gospel in a different way than people before Jesus did, right? And he's giving them very, very practical advice. And that's what we've been going through, right? And it started with this thought of him trying to tell us so that we understand that when you enter into the community of God, when you follow Jesus as Lord, you are a part of God's holy nation, right? If we want to spread the gospel, it's not just the job of pastors, right, who work at churches to do that. It's the whole community. Ministry does not just happen in a church. Ministry happens when all of us leave here, right? And then he talks really practically of, well, what about when that's difficult, right? The people in this church 2,000 years ago, even though they were in their homeland, were treated like exiles and foreigners, immigrants, people that others would look at and say, you're suspicious, you're dangerous, because they didn't believe what the rest of the world believed. And as things went wrong, they blamed these Christians because they didn't go along with how society said you needed to live a good life and how you needed to contribute with society. And they were dying because of it. And Peter talks to them, and he gives them advice on what do you do when the people at the very top, our political leaders, are corrupt and evil, all the way down to what do we do when our spouses are corrupt and evil, and everything in between, right? And he gave us very clear instructions. You do not retaliate with the same tools that these corrupt people use. You don't fight back with violence and hatred and anger. Rather, realizing that we are all a part of this holy nation, that we're all involved in the ministry of spreading the gospel, we need to first and foremost resist sin and live a good life. And then last week we talked about, we've been saying this for a long time. The strongest tool we have, the most powerful tool God gave us as Christians to fight corruption and evil and sin in our world is love. Real, genuine love that resists sin and causes us to live a good life. But really practically speaking, I love people. What does that mean? It comes down to using our mouth well, right? And that's this large, long thought that we've been going through for almost 2 months that Peter is trying to get us to understand. When we live in a world full of evil people, even evil rulers, we don't live lives of disobedience that cause violence, hate, and cycles of destruction and abuse to continue. Instead, we fight it by using our mouths differently. We speak words of love, and we resist words of hate. And then we get to where we're now in 1 Peter 3, and we're going to start in verse 13, just picking up exactly after where we stopped last week. And we're going to go a little bit further into this now. Peter's going to talk about why, and he's already talked about why, but he's going to recap and finish this thought by showing why we live differently. And especially when it comes to how the world tries to use fear to manipulate us. So we're gonna jump in. We're gonna go through some weird parts of the Bible, which is always fun. And then by the end, I think it won't be quite as weird as it probably is before we start. So, verse 13. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? And this is a rhetorical question, right? He's saying, obviously, if you do good things, no one's gonna hurt you. We've for the last month been talking about what do we do when people harm us for doing good, right? Like he's being rhetorical here. He's pointing out the hypocrisy and the corruption of the powers that be that are harming them for doing good, right? Who is going to harm you if you're eager to do good? Bad people. But even if you should suffer for what is right, which is what's going on, you are blessed. That doesn't mean God is against you. It doesn't mean God hates you. God is still for you. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. And to be clear here, I always like to point this out when we're reading the Bible. They talk differently than we did. When we think of heart, we think, oh, I got to follow Jesus here, right? I think here, but I feel here, right? Is that what we think? We didn't know what the brain was and what it did until actually pretty recent in human history. Like for people of ancient past, when we talk about our heart or they talk about their heart, they mean their whole self. That is the center of a person. That's where their volition and will comes from. So he's not just saying like, oh, feel Jesus in your heart, right? Yeah, it's one thing to know him, but you got to feel him, right? No, he's saying your whole self, right? All where your soul, mind, body, all comes together to lead your life. With all of that, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. I'm going to come back to this, but notice, we're talking about words again. Good words and evil words. For it is better, if it is God's will to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water, and this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience towards God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand, with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. Got a little weird there, didn't it? So I think the first part of this makes pretty clear sense why it's coming directly after this long speech of how do we deal with these people in our lives, even people who have power over us, who are corrupt. And then we get into this spot of like Jesus conquering spirits and angels and going back to the days of Noah and the ark. What is going on? Sometimes the Bible's weird, and that's okay, right? Part of my job is to help you see, like, the Bible's weird sometimes, but it's weird for a reason, for a good reason, right? And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to go to the second half of this verse first and explain that to then explain the first half, because they're both very intimately connected, but I feel we get to that second part, and we're like, I don't know what's going on anymore, and now all of 1 Peter's weird again, right? So, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. Now we know what that's talking about, right? Jesus came to save us. And on his mission, on the world to save us, it cost him his life. We talk about this every week. The miracle and amazing salvation of Jesus. It cost him his life. But he's able to save us because he walked out of his grave alive, because he is the righteous king who saves. It's pretty clear, I think. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through the water, and this water symbolizes baptism. It now also saves you. Now, we know kind of what he's talking about here, right? A lot of us, if we've been in church world a long time, we know the Noah story, right? God looks at the world in Genesis 6, and it's so full of violence and evil that he regrets that he had made mankind. And he decides, I'm going to do something about it. Which we often say, God, why don't you do something about it? And he responds saying, I'm going to kill them all. This is perhaps the darkest moment in all of the scriptures. But our God is so compassionate, so loving. He cares so much about us that even when he makes this declaration that the world is so evil and so violent, I'm just going to destroy it, he decides I'm actually not going to do that. I'm going to find a way to save these humans without just murdering all of them. That's good news, right? We often think, God, why don't you just fix all of this? And God shows us through the scriptures, if I did it the way humans want me to do it, you're all dead. But Jesus is a sign that God wanted to do this differently. And so he dies instead of us. And then while he's dead, he begins to communicate with imprisoned spirits back from the ancient days of Noah. What in the world is going on? So I would love to spend a lot of time really explaining the Hebrew mindset, because you have to remember, Peter is a Jew. He was raised as a Jew. He believes the world works the way Jews thousands of years ago thought the world works. And we don't think the world works that way anymore. We think differently. In some ways, that's good. In other ways, maybe we've lost something. And so Peter believes something that we don't quite believe. And if we were to go through the Old Testament slowly, we could see that there's a clear theme, and we just don't have time to do that, hopefully at some point. But what Peter believes in this passage, which is so relevant, is that when God set up the nations over the world, all the nations didn't just have human rulers, they had spiritual rulers behind them. And the New Testament clearly believes this is also true. When we look out at our world and see these people who are evil and corrupt leading our world into the cycle of just sin, and we say, why does this happen? It's easy to just say, well, humans are really terrible. And to some extent, yeah, humans are corrupt. But the Bible also believes that behind bad human choices, especially the bad human choices of rulers, world leaders, there are spiritual rulers and leaders behind them. And I will admit to you, as your pastor, man, that sounds really weird to me. When I think of the world, that's not typically how I think of it, right? When I go into coffee shops and restaurants and I make small talk with strangers, I don't talk about like, oh yeah, Putin's crazy because of weird spiritual forces ruling him around. Like people would look at me weird, right? And it's okay to say, man, that kind of feels weird to say that. But that's actually what the Bible believes. It believes that behind the rulers and leaders in this world, there are spiritual forces behind the corrupt things going on. Now, this doesn't take culpability away from humans, right? We're still responsible for the actions that we make, but it opens our eyes to realize that there is more wrong with our world than just humans being selfish and sinful. That's part of it, but it's not all of it. But what makes the church different is that the nation of God, the holy nation of God, which, remember, we talked about, is the church. It's not Russia, it's not China, it's not Britain, it's not the US. All of those nations, every nation on this world is ruled by spiritual forces that are not the triune God except one. And that is God's holy nation, which Peter told us just a chapter ago, that is the church. Nation and people of God is everyone who follows Jesus as Lord. And what Peter is trying to make clear in this passage right here to these people who are controlled by wicked and corrupt rulers like Caesar, like slave masters, and like non-Christian husbands, is that their power is not as strong as they think it is. Because Jesus was killed by the powerful rulers of this world using their most powerful tool. They killed him. and he walked out of his grave. Because God, the triune God, is the author of life. His most powerful tool is not death. It is that he can go to a clump of dirt and pull out life. He can look at rocks and create children of Abraham. He is far more powerful. The rulers of this world, human and spiritual, killed Jesus the King, and he walked out of his grave. And so theologians and Bible scholars really argue a lot of what did Jesus say to these imprisoned spirits? And I've spent so much time looking into this. I'm convinced, and there are smart people who disagree with me, but I'm convinced personally that what Jesus did in this moment is he proclaimed to all forces, all spiritual forces, all the ones that have been ruling over this world since the beginning for thousands of years, that they have lost and that God has won. And that's why he concludes this section with that last phrase in verse 22 of Jesus, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. You see what Peter is saying here? He's looking at this church that is scared of the human authorities who threaten to beat them and kill them and persecute them. And he just went on this long rant of why they shouldn't retaliate with violence. And then he's concluding with this statement of, we don't need to act the way the rest of the world acts because our true ruler rules over those people. He even rules over the forces ruling behind them. Let's go back to the beginning piece, though. So this is verse 13 again, and it's 13 through 17. Who is going to harm you if you're eager to do good, even if you should suffer for what is right? You are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord, right? With your whole self. Remember, the true king is your king, not these people threatening you, not these people holding power over you. And always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. All right, let's stop there. So first, in verse 14, we actually have a quote from Isaiah. So it's where he says, but even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. And then we have quotes. Did I put them on there? I did. Then you have quotes. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. This I actually would argue, I don't know why the NIV translates it this way. Most Bible translations don't. They translate it closer to the quote that we find in Isaiah 11 through 13, which you'll see that the second verse here is what Peter's quoting. But I gave us more, so it makes sense. So this is Isaiah. Isaiah is speaking to the Israelites before Jesus. We're getting into another nerdy part, but you gotta trust me. It's good. Isaiah is warning Israel because the Assyrian army, the largest world power at the time, at least in this area, is coming to destroy Israel. And Isaiah is trying to battle the corruption in Israel's government and through the populace, arguing that if you guys don't follow Yahweh as your Lord and King, he is going to let another king take over, and you guys are going to be destroyed. Not because God likes destruction, not because he hates you, but because you guys are just as wicked as everyone else. And God would much rather you repent and return to living in a way that follows him. But if you don't, you're going to be destroyed. Because God is a God of justice, and you guys are bad. It's a different sermon, though. And Isaiah has God say to him, this is what the Lord says to me, with his strong hand upon me, warning me not to follow the way of this people. And this is corrupt Israel, right? Do not call conspiracy everything this people, right, corrupt Israel, calls a conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, and do not dread it. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread. In other words, there are people in society in Israel looking at the demise of their nation, and they see its fall coming. And they're pointing to all sorts of conspiracies and different reasons why this is happening. And they're trying to get people scared because they're trying to get people motivated to join this faction, this side, that side. Remember, at this point, Israel is cut into two nations because of civil war and division. And this is what humans do. When our world is a place of darkness and it starts getting harder and harder to thrive, we start pointing fingers. And people want you to blame the people that they want you to blame. And other people want you to blame other people that they want you to blame. And how do they get you to see the world the way they want you to see it? They start finding ways to make you afraid. That doesn't happen in our world today, does it? We haven't changed so much. Isaiah is looking at this world and he's like, you're watching your nation fall and you're pointing fingers at everything that you can, but you need to understand the only one who can really save you is God. And the only thing in this world that you actually have to be afraid of is God. Because he is good and he is powerful and there's nothing that can harm you if he doesn't want it to happen. Let's go back to 1 Peter, that first section. Who's going to harm you if you're eager to do good? If you're eager to follow God, who in this world can harm you? But you say, but they are harming me. Yeah, but if you suffer for doing what's right, for following God, you are in God's favor, and you're going to be okay. So NIV translates it, do not fear their threats, but think of it more as what he's trying to say in Isaiah. And this is how most translations translate it. Do not fear what other people fear. In other words, they fear Caesar, and they fear these rich slave masters, and they fear these non-Christian husbands because of the power that they wield over us. But the power that they have, at its strongest, is death. Christians don't need to be scared of death, right? Just as Isaiah said, God is the only one you need to be scared of. He tells us, revere Christ as Lord. In other words, remember what Isaiah said. We only need to fear God because he is the true ruler of this world and he is all powerful. On this side of the cross, we know Jesus is the triumphant king. That's why he goes and talks about it right afterwards. Jesus has conquered everything. And so there are people in this world that are going to try and manipulate those of us in the family of God. And they do it to everyone. They're going to try and manipulate us to live life the way they want us to live life, through fear and conspiracies. Our world, it looks like it's falling apart, and the world wants you to be scared so that you live life according to the way the world wants you to live. But Peter is telling you, if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, if you call Jesus Christ your Lord and you understand that he has conquered everything that is evil, we don't need to be afraid of what the rest of the world is afraid of. And I know this is hard, right? I live in the world too. Every time my wife goes grocery shopping, she says the same thing. Why are groceries so expensive? Right? These are real troubles. Life is getting more and more expensive. It's getting harder to run a home, to care for our families, to live a life where we can just have normal enjoyment, right? We fear for the future. We make plans where we say, I don't know if the future is going to look how I want it to look. I don't know what our society is going to look like tomorrow or in a month or in a year. And there are people all over the world trying to get us scared so that we listen to them. I hear people every week all over the political spectrum because, yes, you are sitting next to people that believe different things than you. All over the spectrum who are scared of what the news is trying to tell them they need to be scared of. And it is causing them to not live the way Christ is calling us to live, but instead to live with anger and to live with hate and to talk about other humans as if they are evil and they're the enemy and not made in the image of God. And Peter has made it very clear to us that if we are going to fight against the evil forces in this world, we need to be thinking about how we use our mouth. We are not manipulated by the fears that this world puts in front of us because we know what the rest of the world doesn't know. Jesus is greater. Our world is full of evil and corruption from humans and spiritual forces. I can't tell you exactly how that works. It sounds a little weird, but I can tell you that those powers killed Jesus. They put him on a cross, and they watched until his heart stopped beating and his lungs stopped breathing. They put him in his grave for crying out loud. But he walked out with his heart beating and his lungs breathing again. I don't know everything about how this world works, but I can tell you, Jesus is the true King of the world. And we do not need to live our lives in fear for tomorrow because he loves us and he takes care of us. It was true when Isaiah said it thousands of years ago. It was true when Peter said it thousands of years ago. And it's true today. And what we need to pull out of this passage is an awareness of how the world is trying to manipulate us through fear. And so when you are listening to people who are telling you how to live your life, if they are using fear as their motivator, I encourage you, as your pastor, turn it off. If they are using love and hope and the gospel of Jesus to motivate you, that's excellent. But if they're using even the gospel of Jesus as a tool of fear, turn it off. Peter makes that very clear right afterwards when he tells us what we need to do when our eyes have been opened. Because when this happens, we're going to live differently than other people. Everyone else is scared, right? They're going to start hoarding toilet paper because everyone else is, and they don't think they're going to have enough. But we live differently, and eventually people are going to want to know why. And that's why Peter says to us, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Again, what do we do, Alex, when the rest of the world isn't following Jesus and I want to follow Jesus? Don't let the world manipulate you with fear, and be conscious of how you use your mouth. Don't respond to insults and abuse with insults and abuse. Respond with language that promotes peace. And always be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have. Why are you not scared? Because Jesus rules the world. There are corrupt leaders in this world. There are corrupt neighbors in this world. There are corrupt evil spirits in this world. Some people will try to use that as a source of fear. But there's no reason to be afraid. Because all of them, everything, has been conquered by Jesus, and he rules the cosmos. And it might be cheesy, I'm going to say this again, to tell people that. Why aren't you living the way I live? Because Jesus died for my sins. We've talked about this. That's hard to evangelize that way. Most people don't care about their sins. Most people don't care or even believe in spiritual forces. But I encourage you in moments like these, when you live differently, sometimes you might have to be talking to yourself. Why am I not doing what these other people are doing? They're scared. Shouldn't I be scared? No. So sometimes you might have to do this to yourself. But also, sometimes you're going to have to talk to other people about Jesus. And you don't need to do this in a cheesy way, right? Peter says do this with gentleness, do this with care. You don't do it in a way that's forceful and harmful. You do it in a way that promotes hope and peace. And sometimes people will say, I don't know what I think about that Jesus guy. And I want us to remember the heart of the gospel is that God is going to fix everything that has been broken. Every scar, outside and inside, is going to be fixed. Everything that has been broken in this world will be rescued by God. Which means if you follow him, at one level or another, it's going to be different for all of us. We should experience some level of healing and change in our life. And so when someone looks at you and says, I don't know what I think about that Jesus thing, you don't need to give them a cheesy gospel tract. I encourage you, be vulnerable and share with them. How has Jesus brought healing to your life? And maybe you haven't experienced that. And you want to know what it's like to live a life without fear, but hope for the future. Maybe you want to know what it's like for those scars on you and in you to be healed. I encourage you to think through what it looks like to live a life where Jesus is the King of your world, where you submit to him and not the people who are trying to rule you with fear. Your life will change. You will be given the ability and the power to change the world around you, and you can live with hope like you never could have beforehand. Do you believe me? Well, let's start talking about it. Will you pray with me? Dear God, we thank you so much that you have given us such power and that you've given us just such faith that you allow us to participate in the work of spreading your gospel, God. This world so desperately needs you. And we know this world is only going to have real peace when every knee bows before you as its king, God. But you've tasked us with the job to start spreading the word. And we do that by living differently, by speaking differently, and by believing the truth that you are the true king of the world. And so, God, we ask you to please change our hearts. Change whatever it is inside of us that you need to change so that we can live with this true hope, knowing that it is real. And that the confidence we put in you is not just some fairy tale to make us feel good, but that it is the concrete reality of our world. That you are God, that you are good, and we can trust you to save us. And I pray, God, that as each of us leave this building today, that you will give us opportunities, as difficult as it may be, to resist sin and to live a good life and to use our mouths well. And that when fear looks us in the face, that we won't fear what the rest of the world fears, because we know that you rule this world and you are good. And we ask that we may have the opportunity to spread the reason for the hope that we have to people who don't have that hope, so that we can help you in your mission to save the world and to spread the good news that Jesus is alive and he will fix everything. Amen.
All right, everybody, we're going to move into the time of communion. And if you haven't had a chance, go ahead and grab a cup back there. I wanted to bring up Hannah because I want to tell you a little bit of a story. And it's been a part of our lives for a while. But I've had the privilege to join Tonya throughout dating her and being married to her to teach Sunday school for several years. And one of the things that we like to do is share what communion means to the kids. Because usually that message is not brought to the little kids until they're sitting in the sanctuary and they hear it from the pastor. But it's something that we've been able to share with our kids. And this one really has learned what it means to have communion and also give communion. And so here's a little story. We all experienced COVID, and we all had to watch church online. And at the time, we were nearing Easter, and the service that came on was just very heartfelt. And one of the things that the pastor asked everyone to do at home was, hey, go grab some crackers or juice. And right away, Hannah got up and grabbed all the stuff, going through the fridge, trying to find crackers, whatever she could find, hoping that she wouldn't grab the prune juice because that'd be a little weird. But she grabbed everything and put it all out on the table, on the coffee table for all of us. And she gave it to us. Didn't just leave it on the table and say, here you go. She gave it to us. And so I want to share that with you guys, because when you're at home, you can do communion with your family. When you're at a restaurant, you can do communion with your family. And you can also let your children be a part of it. And you can let them understand what it means. And so I wanted to share this little bit of the Bible. In 1 Corinthians 11, 24 through 26 and 11 through 11 verse 28. First, we're going to do the verse in 28. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. That's something that I think every single one of us can always do before we come to the Lord and have communion, is we need to examine ourselves. We need to make sure that we understand what we're doing. We need to make sure that if we're not sure what God did for us, we need to ask. We need to ask, God, what did you do? Well, we know just by what Pastor Alex just said. He died for us, and we don't need to fear the things of this world. He died for us so that we can have a relationship with God. He died and he rose from the grave. Jesus asks us to do communion as often as we break bread, as we drink a drink. And so I encourage all of you, not just here, make it a routine, make it a habit. There's lots of bad habits out there, because obviously the world teaches us that we need to have some really bad habits. But this one allows us to remember who Christ is and what he did. Okay, so let's move on. Verse 24, and when he had given thanks, he broke the bread, and he said, "This is my body." which is for you to do in remembrance of me. Let's go ahead and eat. In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Father God, I thank you for the opportunity to share just a little story about what happened in my life, but I pray that this community and this church today would take that story and be reminded of something that has happened in their lives, that they would be reminded of how you have touched their lives and how grateful we are that you have conquered death, that we are reminded of what your body did, what your blood represents, and that ultimately you did come out of the grave. We thank you so much that we can have this opportunity to always share in this meal with family, with friends, with this community. And God, I thank you for this beautiful daughter of mine that can share communion with so many other people in this world. It's in your strong name I pray. Amen.